When I was in sixth grade, my teacher told us something very interesting. She said it was dangerous to go swimming in the Pacific Ocean because there was so much silt in the water. This silt was small enough that it would enter your pores as you swam, weigh you down, and eventually you would sink and drown. And I remember being fascinated and horrified by this fact, and I counted myself lucky to have heard about it and thought of the danger that I had avoided. But I only held this belief about the dangerous silt-filled waters of the Pacific for about a week. As soon as I told my parents, they set me straight, considering my grandfather, who was a marine biologist, had spent much of his career diving and conducting research in that general area. And both my parents had gone swimming in the Pacific Ocean and hadn't died. Now, this ended up being a pretty innocuous case, but I still remember this fact that I learned and just as quickly unlearned in sixth grade. The reason I never forgot is because I wonder how many other facts like this are inside my head that were never corrected and potentially are much more consequential. How many facts like this are inside of other people's heads? And ultimately, how would any of us know and find them and get rid of them? This is Thoughtful Beetle, and I made this channel to address questions like these and other areas that deserve additional deep thought. But I want to start here with this idea about silt in the sea because I view it as a cautionary tale. Bad ideas like this one, misinformation, and uncertainty are all very much widespread, and for the most part, most people don't examine their ideas closely enough to know if they're right or wrong. A solid fact, or a story about dangerous silt in the ocean. How do we end up determining what's real and what isn't? When it comes down to it, what we know is true or false is often based on the sources of information we use and trust. But on the other hand, many people express frustration that they don't know which sources to trust, and often don't know how to tell if they're telling the truth or not. In a lot of cases, people just rely on sources that other people have told them are good, without ever seriously questioning how they would know if the sources were accurate. Considering how widespread and far-reaching this problem is, I think it is really worth seriously asking the question, how do we tell what a good source is? How do we determine which sources are accurate and truthful? And ultimately, what makes a good source? Here, I hope to provide a framework to help answer this question, and to share some of the tools that I have found help me determine what's a good source and what isn't. This is something I've spent a lot of time studying and thinking about, both in my professional life and in my free time. And the things I'm going to share with you are tools that have served me well in a variety of contexts. While there are many different considerations that go into determining what's a good source and what isn't, I've come up with 5 main ways that you can judge the quality of a source. An easy way to remember them are the 5 C's. Capability, conveys, current, corroboration, and consequential. Capability. Does the source have the capability to answer the question? Conveys. Does the source accurately and completely convey what it or other sources have the capability to answer without adding in unsupported information? Current. Is the source up to date and has not been replaced by new information? Corroboration. Are the conclusions of the source confirmed by other sources that meet the previous criteria of capability, conveys, and current? Consequential. Does the source significantly change your understanding of the world? And if it does, is there sufficient corroboration to warrant accepting this change? Let's start with capability, the most important and also the most difficult of the 5 criteria. Again, capability refers to whether the source has the ability to answer the question at hand. Another way of thinking about it is, do the authors of the source have access to the information necessary to make the claims that they are making? The best way to start assessing capability is to ask a simple question. If I wanted to know the answer to the question the source tries to answer, what would I need to know, and how would I get that information? Once you ask this question, check and see if the source actually knows what needs to be known in order to answer the question, and if it satisfactorily explains how it got that information. If the source fails to do either or both, it probably lacks capability. Additionally, when considering capability, it's important to remember what specific question you or the source is trying to answer. Different questions will mean that different sources have different capability to answer the question. As an example, a personal blog has essentially no capability when it comes to answering questions about large-scale effects on a population, but it has great capability when it comes to answering questions about personal experiences. Similarly, an epidemiological study of COVID-19 can have no capability for answering questions about personal experience, but has high capability for answering questions about large-scale effects on the population. Be careful you know what question the source is trying to answer when assessing capability. Finally, there's another consideration. Just because a source gives the correct answer does not mean it has good capability. Sources can be incidentally correct even when they have no good basis for the conclusions that they draw. Another way of thinking about it is the old saying, a broken clock is still right twice a day. While perhaps counterintuitive, it's very important to recognize that just because a source agrees with other good sources does not mean it has the capability to answer the question on its own. So, capability is complicated, but also very important. Probably the single most important criteria when determining whether something is a good source or not is asking the question, does this source have access to the information necessary to reach their conclusions? Okay, so we've determined if a source has the capability to answer the question. What else do we need to consider? Well, the next criteria is related to capability and is conveys. Most of the time, the sources we see are not original sources of information, but rather someone reporting on original sources of information. We call these secondary sources, while we call the original sources of information primary sources. Most of what we read or watch as news through any of the major news outlets are secondary sources, aggregations of information that have been put together by Fox or CNN or NBC and then presented to us, the viewers. Similarly, unless you're reading scientific journal articles or original reporting or transcripts of an event, which are all primary sources, then most of the sources that you see are secondary sources reporting on primary sources. This means that most of the sources we see are not primary sources and therefore actually lack the capability to answer many questions on their own. This is where conveys comes in. There are two parts to conveys. First, a good source will accurately and completely convey the message of whatever sources it gets its original information from. In other words, a source that lacks the capability to answer a question on its own can still be a good source if it passes along information correctly from sources that do have the capability to answer the question. The second part of conveys applies broadly to all sources, but is something you should especially be on the lookout for in secondary sources. A good source will only convey information that it or other capable sources have the capability to answer. Basically, a good source will not try to claim more than it's able to back up, and will not add in unsupported conclusions or other information. As an example, let's say we have a primary source, which is a study showing that smoking cigarettes increases the rate of lung cancer. If a news station accurately reports that smoking will lead to an increase in lung cancer, but then goes on to say that smoking marijuana will also lead to a similar increase in lung cancer without citing an additional study to back it up, then it has failed the second criteria of conveys. Remember, just because one thing a source says is true does not mean everything it says is true. So, a source has the capability to answer the question, and/or it accurately conveys the information from another source that does have the capability to answer the question. What else makes a good source? Well, we also need to check to see that the source is current. In other words, it's up to date and has not been replaced by new information. Making sure a source is current is often pretty easy. Simply check to see when the source was originally posted, published, or made available. This is often pretty easy to find and is usually prominently displayed. There are no hard and fast rules about just how current a source has to be in order to be accurate, but generally speaking, the closer to the current date you get, the better. For some information, like politics or breaking news, being current is extremely important. Other sources, like historical records, can remain stable for long periods of time, and it doesn't affect their quality. However, there's another aspect of a source being current that is often more difficult, making sure new information hasn't replaced the information in your source. If you only use very current and up-to-date sources, you oftentimes lessen the chance of this happening. But you can have very new sources that still include old and outdated information. One way to avoid this is to seek out sources of information that update themselves regularly, or maintain records of when information was current in the past. A good example of this is records on global temperature averages from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. They have information on what the current global average temperature is, as well as records of what the average temperature has been in the past, and you can go back through the years and see when that information has been current. But the best way to ensure that information in a source is not outdated is to seek out other sources that touch on the same subject and ensure that they corroborate or agree with each other. And this takes us to our fourth C, corroboration. For corroboration, the conclusions of a source must be confirmed by other sources that also meet the previous three criteria of capability, conveys, and current. The idea of corroboration is pretty easy to understand, but it's a lot more difficult to do in practice. This is because sources can disagree, or we can find multiple different points of view. The purpose of corroboration is to help mitigate these factors, and to find sources that have consistent conclusions across many different authors. An important note about corroboration is that it's often easy to think that you are doing it when you're not truly corroborating your source. Oftentimes, there'll be multiple secondary sources that report on the same primary source, and you can think that because you've seen multiple secondary sources, this confirms the conclusions of the primary source. Not so. All this confirms is that the primary source exists, and does not confirm the conclusions of the primary source. To actually confirm the primary source and the conclusions it reaches, you need to find other primary sources that reach the same conclusion as your primary source, but do so by examining different kinds of evidence. But there's one final criteria that I want to add, and it is consequential. Consequential is a lot more subjective and ultimately maybe not as important as the other criteria, but I wanted to include it because I think it's very necessary in order to prevent you from being very, very misled. Consequential means that if a source claims something that will significantly change how you view the world or is extremely impactful, you should seek out additional corroboration, make sure it truly has capability, that it's conveying information correctly, and that it actually is current. While you should still remain very open to the fact that this source could be true if its conclusions turn out to be valid and all criteria are met, you should certainly go through and double-check everything. Remember, the bigger the claim, the more diligent and careful you should be when verifying it. So there you have it, 5 C's to help you determine what's a good source and what isn't. With these tools, you can evaluate sources on even footing and have a good understanding of what makes a good source and what makes a bad source. Of course, you can use these tools in any order that you want. Make your own process that's both consistent and makes the most sense to you. As for when to use this process, I use it pretty frequently. If, for example, I was to visit the BBC website for the first time, I would use this process on several articles that I read over the course of a few visits. This gives me a good idea of the kind of standards that the site keeps, and allows me to know if I can generally trust the information that they put out. Once I know that a site or group has high standards, I often do default to trusting them without having to utilize the 5 C's. However, I will still occasionally check articles or reports from a group that I already trust. Even websites or news sources that do have high standards can, and still do, publish articles or reports that will fail the criteria of the 5 C's. It pays to be on the lookout, and to never assume that just because it's a group that you have trusted, they can't pass along bad information from time to time. As a final note, I think it's extremely important to use the 5 C's even if you've gone a long time trusting sources without ever fully looking into them. I have many friends and family members and acquaintances who trust websites and news channels or other sources of information that consistently fail one or more of the criteria of the 5 C's whenever I look into them. So take the time and check your sources, even if you think they can be trusted. And most important, be open to what you find. Ultimately, the 5 C's are very useful tools, but they don't provide a completely foolproof method for determining what is and is not a good source. It takes time and persistence to use them correctly, and there's many other factors that can influence the quality of a source besides what I've had time to go into here. But by focusing on the capability of a source, how well it conveys information, how current it is, how well it's corroborated by other sources, and considering how consequential the claims it makes are, you can go a very long way in determining what is and isn't a good source, and most importantly, understanding why. Remember, just because you've been told something is true doesn't mean it actually is. After all, if that were the case, I would still be afraid of my pores filling with silt if I ever were to go swimming in the Pacific Ocean. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments how you determine what a good source is, or if there's any particularly useful tools that I've left out of my list. And I'll see you next time.